Hello and welcome to our fourth lecture. We're still in the Bronze Age. We're finishing up. We've moved to a new region this time. We're going to talk about Minos, Mycenae, and the end of the Bronze Age. Okay, so previously we've talked about ancient Egypt. We did that last time. And before that, we talked about the Mesopotamian world. Both of those are Bronze Age cultures where you had cities with defined urban areas, usually walls around them. They had large redistributive economies where you had lots of people farming, and then you had central distribution centers. You had big centers of worship, you had temple centers, you had administrative centers, palaces, that kind of thing. You had all of the features we've already talked about at some length, kind of defining the communities of the Bronze Age. And they had specifically the technology and techniques of producing bronze for tools and weapons. And so that's why we've come to kind of call this catch-all period between roughly 4,000, 3,500, and roughly 1,000 or so BC, this Bronze Age. Well, today, what we're going to do is shift gears a little bit, and we'll talk about a different kind of Bronze Age culture in the Mediterranean. Now, this is the sort of backstory to the cultures that we'll talk about, the Minoan culture and the Mycenaean culture. Is a little bit complicated and exciting. Unlike in Egypt, for instance, where the monuments of the Bronze Age world were very much on display, they were very visible, there was tons to be discovered through archaeological exploration, but things like the pyramids, which are old, part Old Kingdom and very ancient, were always very obvious. And to some extent, the same thing goes with Mesopotamia. Some of the ruins of the ancient world were very apparent in these regions. And so when the first archaeologists really start defining the discipline and beginning exploring the ancient world through uncovering artifacts and trying to translate things like cuneiform and hieroglyphic, they do that with a head start. They already can see where those ruins are. The cultures of Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece are a bit different. Those were not quite as obvious to the naked eye. The remnants that they left behind were not as large, not as monumental. The sort of impact they'd made on the world, unlike Egypt, which was a huge, enormous, long-standing powerhouse of economic juggernauthood, as well as Mesopotamia is only slightly less in terms of powerful and economically long-reaching. Its cities were very large. Compared to that, the sort of Bronze Age Greek world was really quite small. It was not on the same scale at all. And so it really had escaped the notice of kind of archaeologists and historians until quite late. The 1850s and a little bit beyond was when people really started finding artifacts around the Mediterranean that had script on. They started identifying as perhaps being Greek, a little bit different. They're trying to track it down. And so there was just some interest at that time, which is going to explode due to the influence of this guy who's pictured here up in the upper left, Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich Schliemann's story is a fun one, so I'm going to tell you. He was an amateur antiquarian. He was very interested in antiquities, things from the ancient world. He wanted to be an archaeologist. He didn't have any particular scientific training, not that that was easy to do in the later part of the 1800s because it was a brand new discipline. But he was very interested in this kind of thing. And his particular focus, what he was fascinated by, was the Iliad. He was fascinated by the Greek world as it was described in the epic poem, the Iliad. If you're not familiar, the Iliad and the Odyssey are two epic poems attributed by tradition to a Greek poet, Homer. And according to the text of the Iliad itself, it is a story of the conquest and collapse of the ancient city of Troy. And the details that it describes in this epic poem include bits and pieces that are recognizably references to Bronze Age type cultures. And so Heinrich Schliemann was very interested in the Iliad, and he was very interested in trying to uncover the world of the Iliad as he saw it. And he intended to use as his guide to try to find the landmarks that are described there. He intended to use the epic poem itself. And he got a lot of flack for this, as you can imagine. The Iliad was an epic poem very much like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was culturally enormously important. It persists over millennia, where it is translated and copied and recopied. The oldest version, however, uh, possibly dates to about 750, 800 BC. It's nowhere near the Bronze Age. It was centuries and centuries later that the text was produced. And so historians and archaeologists and, literary critics all made fun of Heinrich Schliemann. They're like, this is never going to work. Epic poems like the Epic of Gilgamesh or like the Iliad are full of gods and monsters. The thing is practically fantasy. It's fiction. You can't use that to find the city of Troy. How ridiculous. But Heinrich Schliemann was rich. He had made his own fortune in the California gold rush, as a weird piece of trivia, not by finding gold, but by creating a company that outfitted people who wanted to become prospectors. So he, sold them the equipment and stuff they would need to go and set up and pan for gold out in California. And he accomplished two things by this. Number one, he made himself very wealthy. Number two, he had access to the type of equipment you might want to use if you were going to do some archaeological digging. So he takes his fortune and his opinions, and he travels to what is now Turkey, Asia Minor, and he follows the guideposts in the Iliad, and he talks to some people who are doing some local excavations, and he encounters a guy who's like, I found a really promising site where there's an ancient city. I think maybe we should dig there. And Heinrich Schliemann cross-references with the Iliad. He's like, yes, this is it. And so he tells the guy, go ahead, and he finances an expedition. And from here on, his story becomes something of a cautionary tale, because Heinrich Schliemann's approach to archaeology is, I don't know how to put this. It's kind of sledgehammer heavy. He's going to absolutely rip through layer after layer after layer of this site that was continuously occupied in the ancient world over millennia. And so he rips through a city that would date from the Byzantine Empire. He rips through a city that would date from the Persian Empire. He rips through a city that would date from the Roman Empire. He rips through that down to the kingdoms of Alexander the Great. He keeps, I'm doing this kind of out of order, just that the point is, as you're probably gathering, he just rips through various remnants of ancient cities looking for what he sees as this Bronze Age Greek kind of treasure trove. What he really wants to find is the time of the attack on the city of Troy from the Iliad. And so he just digs, and then when he finds something cool, as he eventually finds some jewelry and gold and various other valuables, he immediately announces that this is what he was looking for all along. And the problem with that being that he dug straight past the layer that would have corresponded to the attack on the city of Troy, if it really happened, and this really is Troy, that would have happened around 1180 or 1200 BC, the very end of the Bronze Age. And he went right past that several centuries earlier to find goods and jewels and valuables from a much older period. But he finds them and they're cool. And he emerges and he lifts up his head and he tells everybody in Europe, I've done it. I found the ancient city of Troy. I found the jewelry of the city of Troy. I found all these wonderful, fantastic gold artifacts. Everybody gets very excited, and he sparks this great interest in the archaeological exploration of the Bronze Age Greek world. And so he's a terrible archaeologist. His methodology is bad. He's destructive. He's terrible about just announcing things are whatever he imagines them to be. For instance, this mask. This is a death mask from one of those Bronze Age Greek kings. We're going to get into a little bit more detail in just a few minutes. And Heinrich Schliemann finds this on the Greek mainland, and he finds an undisturbed grave, basically. He finds the burial chamber of an ancient king, opens the whole thing up, and he tells this story very romantically and at great dramatic length back in Europe. He opens the whole thing up, and he finds the body still, sealed inside this tomb. And on top of it, is place this golden death mask. Very common in Mediterranean cultures to do this for wealthy and important people. Very similar thing done in Egypt, if you can picture that. So he sees this golden death mask and he's like, there it is. Here's the face of the king. Here's the mask. And he describes how, as he's doing this very unscientific excavation and opening up of the tomb, he reaches down and peels back the golden mask. And for one moment, the face of the body that was underneath, because it hadn't been exposed to any air or light in millennia, was perfectly preserved. And then the moment that the environment actually touches it and hits it, it just crumbles into dust. But so he tells everybody he meets, for one shining moment, I gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. Agamemnon is a king in the Iliad. He has no reason to believe this is Agamemnon. It isn't, as far as we can tell. It wasn't. It's still called the Mask of Agamemnon, just out of deference to his eccentricity, I suppose you could say. But yeah, so Heinrich Schliemann's a terrible archaeologist, but he is going to inspire, partly out of pure fury, a whole series of much more serious archaeologists who are more careful about excavating, and he's going to inspire the public imagination and inform people who would not really have been aware were it not for his showmanship. He finds other jewelry. You can see his wife Sophia there, dressed in the jewelry of Helen of Troy, as Heinrich Schliemann used to call it. Again, no reason to think that, but it is Bronze Age Greek jewelry. He's going to inspire the public to be very interested in these Bronze Age Greek cultures, and so there's going to be a wave of actual archaeological exploration that's going to uncover some fascinating and very exciting things. Okay, so quickly before we move on, this is the city of Troy that Heinrich Schliemann explores. And I'm just going to show it to you very, very briefly, just so you can see what's left of the site, as you can see, and a reconstruction on the left of what it would have looked like once upon a time with a walled citadel and buildings around it. The site that Heinrich Schliemann did find and that he did explore and excavate does in fact have a layer from around 1180 BC, which would have corresponded to the sort of tail end of the Bronze Age, that shows burning and destruction and battle. And so it is very likely that in fact Heinrich Schliemann, for whatever his faults, did in fact find Troy. Now, what do archaeologists who are more serious discover once they actually start exploring likely sites in the Greek world? Well, one of those archaeologists, a fellow by the name of Arthur Evans, is going to focus on Crete. And there's a whole list of reasons why he decided to do this, but he does. And he heads to the island of Crete, which is just to the south of mainland Greece. It's in the Aegean. And he starts doing some excavation, and what he finds is mind-boggling. He digs down, and nobody had any idea this was here until the very late 1800s, early 1900s. He begins digging down, and he finds the ancient relics of several big cities that were on the island of Crete, starting around 3000 BC, really quite early in the Bronze Age, and moving forward from there for over 2000 years. The kind of height, the biggest population from what we can tell from the remnants, the biggest amount of buildings, the sort of greatest wealth of this culture that's on Crete seem to have peaked around 1900 BC, so right smack dab in the Bronze Age. And so what Arthur Evans finds are the remnants of cities, the remnants of palaces and art and all kinds of wonderful things. There's fields around each of these cities, much as you find in other Bronze Age cities. They have a lot of the same features. One thing they don't have, and we'll get back to this, the cities on Crete do not have walls around them. So even though they have redistributive centers, even though they have palace and temple areas, even though they have all of the other sort of things we associate with the Bronze Age, what they don't have, very similar to Egypt for long periods of time, are walls around them. Okay, so what do you find inside what Arthur Evans uncovers? Well, We find lots of mosaics, lots of frescoes, paintings, sculptures, the foundations of enormous building complexes. They are really intricate. There's a structure, a series of structures, I guess you could call it, known as the palace at Canosos, which was the biggest of these cities, or kind of right in the smack dab middle of Crete. And it's a little bit misnamed because it's like a huge complex of administrative buildings. It also has grain storehouses and vats where wine was processed, and workshops for pottery and every other thing you can possibly imagine that has to do with kind of life and trade and international relations and all that kind of stuff, was centered at this huge, what we call the palace complex at Canosos, and it's lavishly decorated. Now, the culture that was found there, this Bronze Age culture on Crete, they have a written language. I'll show you that in a minute. But unlike in Mesopotamia and unlike in Egypt, there's no Rosetta Stone, and we never managed to figure it out. The written language of Crete is untranslated. There really isn't much that's left in terms of written material, but what we have is still untranslated. We don't know. And so this culture ends up becoming extremely mysterious. We know that they flourished in the Bronze Age just from archaeological records. We find themes over and over in some of their artistic decorations. For instance, what you see here is an example of something called bull leaping. I don't know if you can see the detail. There's three human figures there. There's a guy in the front kind of grabbing the horns of the bull, a guy behind the bull who's standing, ta-da, having landed on his feet, and then there's a darker reddish figure that's vaulting over the back of the bull. So we find images of this, paintings, frescoes, there's going to be some sculptures, and this is kind of all over the place. And so when Arthur Evans starts doing the digging, and he finds this is a recreation of what the palace would have looked like. And you can see some of the original frescoes kind of still there, the mosaic on the wall. And then some of it's painted, which is fresco, and some of it's mosaic, which is inlaid. When he starts finding the foundations of this enormous complex, it looks like a labyrinth. It looks like a maze because there's so many of these connected and interconnected rooms at different levels, different heights. It's all so complicated. He's like, wow, this is like some kind of labyrinth. And then when he finds all those pictures of bulls and people jumping over bulls, it reminded Arthur Evans of the story of the Minotaur, that sort of classical myth where, to make a long story short, there's a guy, well, let's see, how can I explain the Minotaur story easily and quickly? Basically, the gods get involved, and a queen of an ancient city gives birth to a half man, half bull monster. And since he's half god, her husband, the king, was really reluctant to have him killed. So to contain him, they build a labyrinth and stick him inside it, and then they offer him sacrifices. At any rate, the remnants of this just kind of reminded Arthur Evans of the story of the Minotaur, and so he starts referring to this culture as the Minoan civilization. There's no reason for that. There's no reason at all to think they called themselves that or had any connection to the Minotaur. You don't see pictures of Minotaurs, really just bulls. So that kind of points to one of the major problems that we have with knowing what this Bronze Age culture was like. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't have any epic poems from them. We don't have anything that kind of corresponds to the enormous amounts of records that Egypt leaves behind. Instead, we have a number of articles with writing on it. There was a writing system. We have art, and we have the archaeological remnants of buildings and workshops and garbage heaps and whatever information we can get from material culture. Beyond that, we have to do a lot of guesswork as to what this culture was like. Now, we know they were fairly wealthy from the size of the palace administrative structures. We also know that the territory and terrain around Crete pleasant as it is, very climactically pleasant as it is not large enough. They cannot do the kind of thing that Egypt can do. They cannot do the kind of thing that Mesopotamians can do. They don't have these massive river systems where they're producing massive amounts of food surplus. They're not producing tons and tons and tons of grain. So the question becomes, how did these cultures have enough money? This is why it seems so unlikely to these early archaeologists that they would find real Bronze Age cities with bronze and wealth and palace structures and all of this indication of this elite class of people who were living high on the hog. This was shocking to them because it was really inexplicable. How could Crete possibly be producing enough money in terms of surplus to support this? Well, it seems very likely, partly from our paintings and partly from general analysis and partly just from pure guesswork, but reasonable assumptions, that the Minoan civilization, when it really grew and flourished, was kind of right in the heart of that Bronze Age period, that they were not reliant so much on farming, though they do farm. I don't want to imply that they don't. Most people do. They're not as reliant on producing surplus wealth through farming, but instead, this was a seafaring people. That they do some fishing, which is great and wonderful, but more importantly than that, they seem to have made a prosperous economy largely out of travel, trade, and moving goods from place to place, and doing business with places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. We do see images and artifacts in Minoan Crete that do seem to provide evidence that there was interaction between them and Egypt, for instance, that there was trade, goods, art that was moving back and forth. But they definitely had their own particular and unique style as well. You can see it in various paintings and mosaics. You see their clothing style is very different from pretty much anyone else we've looked at. In most places, we've talked about clothing as quite simple for the majority of people. In Minoan Crete, it's fairly simple for men, though they are often pictured with elaborate hats or headdresses. Those might be gods, we don't know. But women wear these kind of very elaborate dresses, and it's highly structured and very unusual. But beyond that, we have to make a lot of guesses just based on the art that we find because, as I mentioned, the written language of Minoan Crete is untranslated. So we see lots of images like this one. Like I already showed you the painting of the bull leaping. Now you see a statuette of the same thing. It's broken, but as you can see, there's a bull there, and then there's this weird figure kind of bending over behind. So it looks like a person who's vaulting over this bull. What we don't know, frustratingly, is what any of this meant or what people's lives were kind of like or who their interactions really were with. We don't have the kind of records that we have from elsewhere in the Bronze Age world, and so we have to put together a lot of guesswork. So what we do know about Minoan Crete is really pieced together, as I mentioned, from the material remains. Now, we do know that they had a written language. It's called Linear A. And Linear A we find on artifacts, we find it on pottery, we find it on walls written down sometimes, and we find it on lovely, like these clay tokens that were used for a purpose I couldn't really tell you. We also find it on inscribed. This wasn't cuneiform. This was scratched in. You can sort of see it. It was produced in a slightly different way on clay tablets around as well, and stone. Now, it's enormously frustrating to historians because even though we don't really have a lot of the writing itself, there's enough there. We see plenty of examples of it, but it was a syllabic language, much like cuneiform. And unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphic in Egypt and the later Demotic speech, we don't have a key to this. We don't know the language that it was originally written in, and therefore it's never been translated. Linear A is truly kind of a mysterious dead language that we have lots of examples of it, but we have never managed to translate them, and we don't know what they say. There are linguists who are reasonably confident they know what syllables they represent, but it doesn't mean anything to them because the language itself is gone. So this adds a lot to the mystery of the Minoan civilization. Um, we can, however, use this language to gain all kinds of insight into how far Minoan trade and influence got, because we find examples of it outside Crete. We find examples of it on the Greek mainland. We find examples of it on Asia Minor. We find examples of it to the Western Mediterranean as well. And so whenever you find an example of Linear A, you're like, ha, the Minoans were here. Beyond that, we don't really know what it says. Now, at some point, however, somewhere around 1375, 1400 BC, there seems to have been a change that took place in Minoan civilization. There are signs of destruction and disruption. There probably was a major volcanic eruption sometime around 1500, and then possibly again in the 1400s as well. There seems to have been an earthquake. The earthquakes are not unknown in this region. There could have been all kinds of damage. There are signs of burning in the various cities of Crete. And there is a new phenomenon that starts popping up. We start to see a different writing system. It looks similar to Linear A, but it's different. And one of the key reasons it's different, one of the things to know about it, one of the things that makes it so special, Linear B, is even though it's a very similar system, the syllables translate into a language that is an earlier form of Greek. And so Linear B has been translated. So to recap, what happens and what you find is that you have these, for more than a millennia, you have flourishing cities, you have all these indications of prosperity and growth and these big palace centers, and you have all this administration. And then you get a period of disaster, burning, collapse, and a new language appears. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to put two and two together and say, aha, there's been a conquest. Something has happened. Either disaster left them vulnerable, or this disaster was a result of the conflict, and nobody really knows for certain. But what happens to the Minoans is that they seem to have become seriously diminished starting in the 1400s, and then overtaken and dominated by a new group of people who are using a different writing system that's similar but in a different language. So very likely that we're looking at a conquest of the Mycenaean Greeks. Now, this might have been facilitated by the fact that Minoan Crete had its own particular vulnerabilities. Now, it seems during the height of their civilization that they were very successful. They were very prosperous. You can see that from the wealth that seems to have been accumulated by the people who built these fabulous palaces. And it seems that pretty clear that their wealth really revolved around their seafaring activities. And you can see a reflection of that as well on the island. Unlike in Mesopotamia, you don't find city walls. The remnants and ruins of the Minoan cities do not have big walls around them. That's an indication, a likely indication, that Minoan cities did not war with each other on the island. There wasn't a lot of intercity fighting. Instead, it seems like they seem to have an understanding, they seem to have gotten along. If they weren't united in a single kingdom, then at least they weren't constantly at each other's throats. And they don't have to worry about attack from outside for most of their kind of cultural time of dominance. They don't have to worry about anyone coming to attack them because they themselves have the most powerful navy in the region, so they don't have to worry about it. That circumstance seems to have changed starting around kind of the mid-1400s into the 1300s. They're no longer the only game in town. So let's look at who else might be a potential rival. This culture is known as the Mycenaean Greeks. I sometimes wonder if this is just a name that is in use to confuse students. This is Bronze Age Greece. And they are going to use a writing system called Linear B, which we just talked about. And you're going to find Bronze Age Greek settlements sprinkled all over what is now mainland Greece and beyond. We're going to find Greek city-states with Linear B and some of the structures we associate with Bronze Age towns and cities kind of all over the Aegean at this point. So if you can see the map on the left, Canosos is one of the cities that is going to continue to be wealthy and going to continue to be important well into the time period when the Mycenaeans seem to have become culturally dominant in the Mediterranean, at least this chunk of the Mediterranean at that time. So you find all of these, see the dark red specks, all of these places where archaeology has revealed palaces, fortresses, or settlements where we find bronze, where we find some of the tools, weapons, trade goods, various treasures, and so forth that reveal that Bronze Age cultures were active in that region. Now, among those bunches of little dots, you see some bigger squares. I don't know if you can pick that out. It's not really that important, but you see where the names are. There are a big handful of places you would straight up call cities. Now, compared to the size, the sheer scale of, say, Egypt at this time, these city-states are really quite small. They're very minor. They don't have that many people in them. They certainly meet the qualification for cities. And they have some of the structures of cities as well. They have walls, as you can see. The Mycenaeans did build walls around their cities. They have walls, they have palace structures, they have temple structures, they have indications that they live in a classic kind of Bronze Age redistributive economy. They have these city structures, but compared to the great cities of Sumer or the great cities of Babylon or the great cities of Egypt, this is a backwater. These are tiny places. But nevertheless, they may have been on a small scale, but they were Bronze Age cities. They seem to have been led by a centralized government, a single ruler, a king that had a lot of authority over soldiers that answered directly to him. And they seem to have done a mixture of making a living off farming and making a living off of maritime trade, much like the Minoans before them. They're going to come to dominance a bit later than the Minoan civilization. Their cities are going to flourish just a little bit more recently. And they are going to rely heavily on trade, much like the Minoans do. Just like on Crete, the territory of Greece, the terrain of Greece, is challenging for farmers. It's high, it's rocky, it's fairly mountainous. It's not like alpine or anything, but it's rocky and mountainous. There's not a ton of great farming soil. There's not a ton of rainfall, though it's certainly much more than Egypt. There's no major river. There are smaller rivers. There's no major river like the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates to provide this great fertile delta farmland. And so farming in Greece is a tough prospect. It's not easy to make a living. It's certainly not easy or even possible to produce massive surpluses you can then use for trade. It's very, very difficult to do that. And so therefore, these Bronze Age cities, and we know less about them than we might like, because even though they do leave written records, and we have archaeological records, those records aren't nearly as complete as we might prefer. What we find mostly are lists of things, names, occasional scraps and pieces of information. We don't have anything as complete as we would like to shed light on how exactly these cities interacted with each other, or exactly what their governmental structures were, any of those things. But what we do know, purely from logistics, is that they were getting a lot of the money they needed to make this work, these Bronze Age cultures, from trade. And so these Greek city-states in mainland Greece and on Crete, they are highly dependent, and the Minoans were highly dependent as well, on trade with other Bronze Age cultures. They definitely needed that in order to make their lifestyle possible. Okay, so you can see some examples here of some of the goods with pieces of linear B written on them. This vase here is labeled Thebes. It probably originally held oil, just by looking at it. It may have been wine or something else, but most likely oil. It says Thebes, so it's kind of like a branding thing, like this thing came from Thebes. And then on top you can see a tablet with linear B, and then you can see some of the treasures that made archaeologists like Schliemann and Arthur Evans fascinated and thrilled with some of this Bronze Age cities. And it's an indication that at least the elite classes of these Bronze Age Greek cities were very wealthy. They'd accumulated enough wealth to, I guess, produce things like a sword or a dagger. That's a dagger there that was inlaid with gold. And you can see the gold is perfect because gold doesn't rust or corrode. So you see the gold is in excellent condition, and then the actual bronze dagger has broken down a bit over the years that's around it. And then there's a golden cup that's in basically pristine condition. That's above that has a beautifully detailed hunting scene. They're employing artisans that are producing extremely high quality work. They're employing massive numbers of potters and builders and sculptors and everyone along those lines. And so this is a culture that's clearly accumulating wealth and is flourishing and growing. And the leaders, at least this elite class, have a lot of resources that they can call upon. And they are able to turn that. Bronze Age kings in Greece, the Mycenaeans, are kings. They have resources at their disposal. They're able to be buried in things like these, the Tolos tombs. These are really quite large structures. You can see the scale if you look at the picture on the bottom. That's the interior of the tomb with a person inside it with a little kid. So if you can see those little specks, those are people. They're really quite large. They're built into the sides of hills, and they were meant to be tombs housing the bodies and goods of kings that had passed on. And they're all looted in the ancient world, and people who lived locally lost track of what these were and what they were for. But as I have a little note there on the side, later Greek accounts, and when I say later, I don't mean like 20th century Greek accounts. I mean people from a few centuries after the collapse of the Bronze Age will record that these are the houses of the Cyclops, creatures from the Odyssey, described in the Odyssey, kind of the one-eyed giants that harass Odysseus. That's what these were, because at that point they'd lost track of what Bronze Age Greece was like. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. There's a massive rupture between the Bronze Age Greeks and those that come after them. At any rate, during this time period when the Bronze Age is flourishing, it seems like the city-states that you find on mainland Greece, islands, and on Crete are participating in and they're benefiting from a kind of interconnected economic relationship with places like Egypt especially, and Mesopotamia as well. And they're able to translate that into these highly centralized governments. Now, you don't have major kingdoms established. It's not even as far along as you would see in some place like Mesopotamia, where you have regional kingdoms that rise and fall and they get replaced a lot, but you do see groups and people become dominant and rule many cities at once for periods of time. And it's certainly nothing like Egypt, where you have these long dynasties that go on and on and on for, in some cases, millennia. Without having a serious political rupture or disruption. It's nothing like that in Greece. Each of the city-states of Mycenaean Greece, Bronze Age Greece, seems to be more or less independent. They're ruling themselves. They're not establishing large empires. There do seem to be periods of war and conquest where you might have a king take over more than one city, but for the most part, these are going to remain separate and independent, not major empires. They're also on a much smaller scale than the other Bronze Age cultures we've already talked about, but they are nevertheless true Bronze Age cultures. They are places where there are palaces. There are places where there's centralized leadership. There are places where kings can command enough resources to have lavish tombs built for themselves. This is going to be in stark contrast to what we're going to find just a few centuries after. Okay, so sometime around the 12th century BC. And you could put it forth even a little bit beyond that. Now, there seems to have been a major volcanic episode in about 1500 BC, And that may have something to do with collapses in places like Crete, where probably if there was a tidal wave or if there was, and there seems to have been ashfall from the archaeological record, but it wasn't particularly heavy, that it may have done agricultural damage. It may have done damage to the naval fleet. It may have done damage to other things and opened the door for invasion and conquest. We're not entirely sure. But starting around the mid 1300s and escalating into the 1100s, by the time you get to the 1100s BC, what you find is evidence all around the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, of problems, food shortages, unrest, cities being showing signs of burning and destruction. There seems to be all kinds of issues and problems in Egypt. Again, the most sort of prosperous and stable of these Mediterranean societies. You see disruption associated with people who are referred to mysteriously as the sea peoples. We're not entirely sure who they are, if indeed they are one group of people. But it seems like there were attacks on Egyptian trading voyages. There were attacks on Egyptian cities. There were battles. And we find this all over the place in the Mediterranean. This map shows a little bit some of what I'm talking about between 1200 and 1000 BC. All of those little fire symbols are places where there was destruction, where there were important cities that end up getting leveled and the population disappears from the archaeological record. In Egypt, where you see those little, lots of, well, at least 3 of those little castle-y things, the little castle-y things indicate places where there's evidence of warfare, but the city survives. So it doesn't get destroyed and it is going to continue. And so you see some of these little castle-ys in Mesopotamia, that's that kind of pale green there, headed toward Babylon, Assur, Nineveh, etc., and Assyria. Then you see a couple on the eastern coast there of the Mediterranean. I guess that's the western coast, but yeah, you can see there a Tyre is still there. And then you see that Egyptian cities managed to survive as well. However, there's going to be everywhere in the Bronze Age Mediterranean massive political collapse. The new kingdom is going to fall apart in Egypt. There's going to be a period of political disarray. Cities are going to start putting walls around themselves and show signs of being independent and fighting for their own survival. Without the massive protection of the centralized government. You're going to see the same thing happen in the Hittite kingdom. You're going to see the same thing happen in Mesopotamia, and you're going to see it most extremely in the Greek Bronze Age world. All of those Greek city-states, basically all of them, will be flattened during this time period. There's signs, archaeologically speaking, of burning and destruction. And then, if you had to use archaeology alone, it looks like 90% of the population of Greece disappears. Now, that's not very likely that 90% actually disappeared. That's a high figure. But that's what it looks like if you're using the archaeological record alone. Because all of the signs and evidence we have of people living there to begin with largely centers around city life. Cities are wonderful for archaeologists because they leave more permanent structures behind to be found. They're bigger buildings, buildings built out of stone, more kind of large-scale agriculture that you can readily identify, with canals and dikes and things like that. We can readily identify as belonging to that culture. Big garbage dumps, big grave sites, cemeteries, for instance. All of these are much easier to find if you're dealing with the remnants of a larger group of people. If people all abandon the city, though, if they run up into the hills and become goat herders, and they live in little wooden shacks, they might be very comfortable. They might be very happy as goat herders. Their lives might be very pleasant and prosperous. But they leave almost nothing behind them that a historian and archaeologist could realistically find. If people are buried in tiny little grave sites on the sides of mountains, the odds of stumbling upon them and being able to do a forensic analysis it's incredibly low. The odds of finding whatever might be left of wooden structures, it's just not high if they're scattered around and they're just one at a time. over the hills. And so you see this kind of disappearance of evidence in the Greek world, particularly, that coincides with what looks like a massive Mediterranean wide disruptive event. Now, this is truly mysterious. There was no mystery of the pyramids, but there is a mystery of the collapse of the Bronze Age. We're not sure what happened. We don't know why there's suddenly warfare everywhere. We don't know why all these cities burned down. We don't know why everybody abandoned this and ran off into the hills. It could be that it's a domino effect, that you have trade routes disrupted, and so food supplies that were meant to supply the cities of, say, Mycenae and Pylos and Knossos, that they don't arrive, and then there's famine, and then there's massive destruction as a result of that. It could be that there's warfare between one or several groups that ends up wrecking everything, and it wrecks the trade routes, and it wrecks the sort of basic economy that was making the Bronze Age work. We just don't know what the deal is. So there's this mysterious collapse somewhere between 1200 and 1000. There are people who theorize it may have something to do with a volcanic eruption or an earthquake or something, but there really isn't much physical evidence of that. The volcanic eruptions and earthquakes we know about were hundreds of years earlier. It doesn't really seem to be directly connected, though it may be a long-term effect. So, what happens as a result? There are two main consequences if we're talking about the Greek world primarily. There's going to be a massive amount of migration. People are going to begin moving around. Whenever there's a massive disruption and a series of destruction and warfare, you do see this. It's called a diaspora, where people disperse and go elsewhere. This is particularly notable in the Greek world. Remember, it looks like 90% of the population disappear, archaeologically speaking, from the Greek mainland. That's very unlikely that that's an accurate reflection of how many people remained, because it's not probably tracking people who just abandon the city and run off and live rural lives. But what we do know with some confidence is that there's, at the end of the Bronze Age, right between 1200 and 1000, there's going to be the beginnings of an early and massive migration. You're going to have lots of people leaving Greece and settling elsewhere around the Mediterranean and forming what will be known as colony cities. We'll talk about them in greater detail later. This is going to be an early wave, and it's mostly going to move to the east. And so most of the Greeks are going to end up toward the Black Sea area. So they're going to come up through the Aegean, end up in Asia Minor, around the Black Sea, perhaps a little bit along the coast of the Levant there, down by Cyprus, and toward Egyptian territory. But really, there's going to be a wave of people who are going to be leaving Greece. There's also going to be people leaving pretty much everyone else. We're not going to get into all of it, but there seems to be groups of people who leave the Hittite kingdom. There seems to be groups of people in Egypt that just kind of all sort of accumulate in Egypt as a safe place to hide. There's just all of this shakeup and change. Now, what this does in Greece is that it creates a deep and almost impenetrable rupture with the collapse of the cities, the Bronze Age cities and societies that are associated with them. There's an almost complete forgetting. Linear B disappears. People stop using it. It was a widespread use, a language in use for trade and communication. It was all over the place. You find Linear B on all kinds of things, artifacts, lists, all sorts of stuff. But it disappears. And when writing begins again in Greece, they don't go back to Linear B. It's not like there's a gap and then you don't find anything and then there's Linear B again. No. What in fact happens is that the Greeks are going to adopt a totally different writing system once they begin writing again. There is a really serious cultural fracture. There's all kinds of other evidence of the seriousness of this cultural fracture as well, like the stories of the houses of the Cyclops. There seems to be evidence that while some elements of this Mycenaean Bronze Age Greek culture survive in Greek folklore and in Greek stories and in epic poems, there is also lots of evidence that things are totally forgotten, that people didn't remember how warfare was actually conducted in some ways. They didn't remember how governmental structures actually worked, because there's going to be this time period starting around 1100 BC, where those cities dissolve, they disappear, people run off, they form colony cities, they go off into the hills, and they have no political or cultural continuity with that Bronze Age way of living their lives. And so when they start forming cities again, they do it on a totally different model, and everything seems to have changed and become very different. Okay, so this time period I'm talking about, from the end of the Bronze Age into when we see writing emerging again, around 750 BC, is sometimes referred to as Dark Age Greece. Now, they don't say this because this is a bleak or unpleasant time in Greece. As I mentioned, if you ran up into the hills and became a goat herder, it's possible that you've lived an incredibly pleasant and peaceful and enjoyable life where you never wanted for anything and everything went great. That's entirely possible, plausible even. However, we call it Dark Age Greece because our sources of information as historians dry up. We don't have written records to look at. We don't have archaeological records to look at because goat herders are just not leaving anything for us. It's enormously frustrating. And so when we try to look into this time period, into the past, we're in the dark. We just don't know what is happening. So there's this frustrating gap where we have the Bronze Age and everything that was associated with that, and that was pretty cool. Cool artifacts, cool archaeology, everything is great. Then collapse, destruction, we don't know exactly why. And then around 750 BC or so, we see the redevelopment and establishment of city-states known as the polis. Polis is the singular. And we see the re-emergence of writing and written records in a different format. And so we have this gap in between where we just kind of have to guess what's going on. And the figure you're looking at here, in case you want to guess who he is, this is one of the chief sources of information that we have, because it's one of the only sources of information that we have about what Dark Age Greece might have been like. This is a later Roman statue imagining what the Greek poet Homer might have looked like. Now, Homer is himself something of a problematic figure. We're not even entirely sure whether Homer actually existed. There is one way of interpreting the word Homer in ancient Greek to translate it as no one. So it's possible the Iliad and the Odysseys were intended to be attributed to Anonymous. We're not entirely sure, but there is a Greek tradition that goes back to 750 BC or so that Homer was a real person, a poet who was blind, who composed these two massive epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Iliad I talked about a little bit when we talked about Heinrich Schliemann, is a discussion of the siege and collapse of the city of Troy and the adventures of the various Greeks who went on that battle. And the Odyssey is the kind of follow-up sequel where one of those warriors, Greek warriors, Odysseus, manages to offend the god of the sea. And so instead of having a relatively quick trip back across the Aegean back to his own town, his own city, his island, Ithaca, he ends up being just tossed left and right and has adventures for about 20 years before he can manage to get back home again. So, the Iliad and the Odyssey are these epic poems. The first written versions we have date from about 750 BC, but they take place at the end of the Bronze Age. So the setting is the Bronze Age. The text itself is written in, I guess you could call archaic Greece, the reemergence of writing in the polis. And yet, many of the elements that the Iliad describes don't look like either one. The kings that are described in the Iliad are actually named Wanaks in some cases. That's a word that survives from Bronze Age Greece. But the actual kings don't behave that way. They don't look like Bronze Age kings. They don't have palaces and administrative structures and redistributive economies. It doesn't look anything like that. You don't see images of kings that are making their fortune on trade, for instance. Instead, the king that you actually see acting in the Iliad, the ones that are actually depicted and described, look much more like what will later be described as a basileus, more of a warlord. And so if you are very, very, very careful and you are aware constantly that you can't put too much stock in your interpretation. You have to do this with extreme delicacy and caution. You could logically make the argument that if the Iliad is set in the Bronze Age, has a few details in it that seem to have survived from a cultural memory of the Bronze Age, but a whole bunch of stuff that has no resemblance to the Bronze Age, and also has no resemblance to the time when it was written down, that maybe what it's describing is a cultural memory of what Dark Age Greece was like. Now, you have to be careful doing this, but it's the best we've got. And so when we talk about this time period between 1000 and 750 BC, the Iliad and the Odyssey end up being some of our best sources. And moreover, even if you can't 100% trust the details that you pull out of the Iliad, or the depictions you pull out of the Iliad, they are still important. The Iliad especially, but the Iliad and the Odyssey both, are the closest thing that the Greek world from 750 onward have to sacred texts. This is as close to a Bible as the Greek-speaking world is going to have. Everybody knows these epic poems. It's very much like the Epic of Gilgamesh. They're entertaining, but they're also culturally very important. Everyone knows all the stories. Everyone knows all the characters. Everyone knows all the moral lessons in them. And so for centuries onward, when we see other types of writing produced by Greeks that talk about leadership, that talk about government, that talk about all kinds of things, images and ideas from the Iliad and the Odyssey are going to absolutely thread their way through much, much later writing. Because whatever the truth was, Greeks from 750 or so onward BC looked at the Iliad and thought to themselves, this is our history. This is the tradition. This is where we come from as a people. And this applies to basically everybody in the Greek-speaking world. So even though each city is going to be its own thing and do its own thing, much as it did in the Bronze Age, they are united by this kind of common language and culture and these common ideas about what it means to have government, what's important in life, that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk about that more in detail when we talk about the Iliad in our reading discussion. But for this, there's a little bit of a passage that gives a breakdown of what a Dark Age king might have been like. And again, use caution here, but this is a suggestion that is laid out there. And it's two leaders that are talking to each other. Glaucus, why in Lycia do we receive a special honor as regards our place in table? Why are the choicest portions served us and our cups kept brimming? Why do men look up to us as though we were gods? We hold a large estate by the banks of the river Xanthus, fair with orchard lawns and wheat-growing land. It becomes us, therefore, to take our stand at the head of all the Lycians and bear the brunt of the fight, that one may say to another, our princes in Lycia eat the fat of the land and drink the best of wine, but they are fine fellows. They fight well and are ever at the front in battle. My good friend, if, when we were once out of this fight, we could escape old age and death thenceforward and forever, I should neither press forward myself nor bid you do so, but death in 10,000 shapes hangs ever over our heads, and no man can elude him. Therefore, let us go forward and either win glory for ourselves or yield it to another. Yay! Very motivational. Anyway, some of the elements you'll note here, when they describe what it means, in the Iliad, when Homer describes what it means to be a king, the emphasis is not on what we would have seen in Egypt, certainly. This is not a pharaoh they're describing. First of all, they're describing kings of really small areas, city-states, like a city in the tiny little area around it. When it describes what it means to be a king, they explain the perks. The perks is they have an honorable place at table. They're served the best food, and their cups are kept full. They have nice land for farming by the river, where most people don't necessarily have nice land by the river. And so they get these good perks, mostly involving food. They get these good perks, that's what it means to be a king, and they earn it. And this is going to be a really important idea. It's described with the Greek word arete, or personal excellence. It's the justification for why a leader would say that he has the right to be given perks, why he has the right to boss people around. It's described here when it says the princes eat the fat of the land, but it's because they fight and they're ever at the front in battle. And they earn glory for themselves by going out and fighting. They're describing a warlord here. And they're describing this very interesting relationship between leadership and personal honor and whether you deserve it or not. And this theme is going to pop up over and over and over again in Greek literature and in Greek politics. This idea that you need to earn your place. This is not something you would see with the pharaoh. Now, the pharaoh would certainly believe that he'd earned his place, but by being a god and interceding with the gods to create prosperity, etc. And pharaohs did certainly go out with the army and fight. But this idea that you have to earn your place as a king, as a leader, as a warlord by actually being in the middle of the melee and doing the fighting yourself, and that's how you deserve it. This is something very much closely associated with what we'll call this Homeric or Dark Age Greek outlook. Now, there are some bits and pieces in the Iliad that do preserve some of the memory of Bronze Age Greece. For instance, there's descriptions of war chariots. Now, war chariots were used in the Bronze Age. You saw them in Egypt, the Hittites used them, and the Mycenaean Greeks appear to have used them as well. We find, artistic evidence of this. We find some archaeological evidence that chariots were used in warfare at the kind of middle of the Bronze Age. There's a fresco from Pylos there, as you can see it, from 1350 BC. There's basically a pottery vessel known as a crater from 1300 BC. Chariots appear to be an important part of Greek warfare at that time. And in the Iliad, there are descriptions of chariots, but by the time you see how people fought in 750 BC, nobody was using chariots anymore. They were archaic, they were gone, nobody ever used them. Even through the Dark Ages, people did not use chariots. It was a vanished technology. But it's one of the things that is preserved as a memory in the Iliad and the Odyssey. The same thing goes, there's some descriptions of certain types of helmets and various other things as well. So there are elements in the Iliad and the Odyssey that do seem to point to the remnants of a cultural memory of what some of the material means of warfare were, for instance, in the Bronze Age. But a lot of what's actually described bears no resemblance to Bronze Age fighting, and it was very different from the style of fighting that was associated with the new political institution. That's in fact where we get our word political from, that was associated with the city-states that develop in archaic Greece around 750 and thereabouts in the Greek mainland and on the islands. These are known as the polis, which would be the plural of polis. And a polis is a Greek city-state, a particularly Greek, I'm bobbling things, particularly Greek style of city-state that are identified by features like the agora or centralized marketplace, Acropolis, which would be the high city. This is a particular kind of cartoonification of Athens is what you're looking at here, where there would be a temple and other important secure areas like an armory and a treasury, etc., usually held in the same place, that would have its own kind of separate and more defensible wall around it. And usually, especially later on, there'd be other features of urban life, like an amphitheater for religious and kind of entertainment purposes, a gymnasium, assembly buildings for the government, places where people could gather to hear court cases, etc., as well as residences and all the other kinds of shops and things you associate with the town. And each of these city-states would have a wall around it for defensive purposes. They're still worried about attacks from other Greek city-states and from outside, and then farmland would surround it in kind of a ring where the food for the polis would mostly be produced. So these polis are going to emerge and develop from 750 onward, even a little bit earlier than that, right around the same time that writing is going to reemerge. This time, the Greeks are not going to use linear B. Instead, they're going to adapt a Phoenician system known as the alphabet. Alphabet are the two first letters in the Greek writing system, so we call it the alphabet. So they're going to adapt that and use that style of writing instead. Now, once they've begun building these polis, there's going to be a very distinctive style of both civic structure and military structure that will be associated with them. Now, before I get into some of the generalizations, I want to emphasize each of these polis is highly individual. They're all self-governing. They're not united into single kingdoms. That's very unusual. Happens occasionally and rarely and for short periods of time, but generally speaking, cities may enter into alliances or, get into feuds with each other. But for the most part, they all do their own thing. They run their own governments, and the governments are not all the same from one to the next. Now, our image of what they're like is highly colored, however, by the fact that by far the greatest amount of evidence that we have that survives about both the archaic and then later classical periods of Greece comes from one particular polis, Athens. And Athens is very unusual in a lot of ways. It's much bigger than many of the other Greek city-states. Most of them are pretty small, down to downright tiny. And it's also has a little bit of a unique character in terms of its political development, which we'll get into in just a bit. But for now, speaking generally, these Greek city-states are going to establish territory immediately around them, and then try their best to defend that and to prosper in this area. But the problem, and this will constantly be a problem, and it comes across a bit in this picture of Athens, with dealing with these Greek polis, is that there isn't enough farmland to go around. If the population starts to get too big, there isn't enough food. There just isn't enough land to put in cultivation to produce enough food for people. And even if there's enough to feed the population as a whole, because everybody's squabbling over the small amount of farmland that is good and high quality, what starts to happen over and over again in Athens, as in other Greek polis, is there's not quite enough land to go around. There's not quite enough resources to go around. And so some rich people will have a lot in their hands, and poorer people will be struggling to survive and have enough food to eat and not end up in debt slavery, much the same way they might have in Mesopotamia. And that becomes a huge intransigent problem, where you have people who make up the majority of the population are poor, and they're not finding it possible to make a living and be comfortable and be prosperous, and they're constantly at loggerheads with people who own more land. One of the ways that this is dealt with in the archaic period and beyond is with the establishment of what is known as colony cities. Now, this map is just to give you a quick visual impression of what happens. When the city-states of Greece in the archaic and later classical period get too populous, when there's not enough resources to support the population, one of the things they do to try to reduce the amount of pressure, social pressure, economic pressure, food pressure on their community, is to send out something known as colony expeditions. These colony expeditions, we saw the first wave of them go out to the Eastern Mediterranean at the tail end of the Bronze Age. So there was already a big wave of Greeks who are going to leave Greece proper and end up all over, kind of sprinkled over the Eastern Mediterranean, forming city-states that look an awful lot like the city-states back on mainland Greece. In fact, you could argue that the very first fully developed polis is not in Greece itself, but in Old Smyrna, which is now Turkey. It's populated by people who speak Greek, who are Greek, who identify with Greece, the Greek language and culture, etc. But they have left the Greek mainland itself to establish a city-state elsewhere. And there's going to be another wave of this right around the 750 BC era as well, where you have tons of these new colony city-states popping up. Well, how did that come to be? Well, here's the process. And this is, again, a generalization. It didn't always happen exactly this way. But here's the basic process. If you have too many people and you're like, there's just not enough land, there's not enough food, we can't carry on, your polis could have basically an election. It's not an election exactly, but basically every household leader would put their name in a big pot written on a piece of pottery. and they'd all get stirred up, and then names would be drawn. This is one of the ways that the colony expedition would be founded. And if your name got pulled, congratulations, you are now part of the colony expedition. And ships would be built and outfitted, and resources would be pooled. Trade goods, various other equipment would be all pulled together from the resources of the polis, from the resources of the town and city, poured onto these ships along with the colonists. And the colonists would represent a significant chunk of the population. They had to, or it wouldn't work. So it could be as many as a third or a fifth or something that was a significant chunk of people would be put on these ships and packed off to go find someplace else. Not necessarily to go and never be heard of again, but to find kind of a place that could be like a satellite part of their polis, part of their town. So they'd go off and they'd venture in their ships and they'd look for a place to settle. And as they're looking, they're going to be looking for places that have good qualities. They've just left because there isn't enough farmland. So primary focus number one, they're looking for a place with good farmland. They want a place with a good fresh water source. They want a good place with a good harbor so they can continue traveling back and forth and communicating with their mother city, known as, in Greek, the metropolis, the metropolis. And so they want a good harbor, they want good fresh water, they want good farmland. If at all possible, they want some other things as well. It would be nice if there were natural resources nearby, timber or amber or gold or copper or any kind of deposit that could be made, kind of taken advantage of. A good trade hub is a good thing that you could be looking for. Friendly neighbors, if you could find them, that you can trade with. These are all things that the colonists would be looking for. So they sail off in their expedition ships, look for a cool place to settle, and then find it. There's a problem, however. Places that have those features, good farmland, good water supply, good harbor, natural resources, are almost never uninhabited. There are usually people in them. So now it becomes a very tricky question of how a relatively small number of people can carve out a place to establish a city from scratch, which they do over and over again. And this is a big part of how the polis develops, because they have the opportunity to keep repeating the experiment. If we're going to create a city from scratch, what kind of features do we want our city to have? But beyond that, moving back to my original point, if you're going to find a place and carve out your city and defend it and keep a hold of it, even though you are a relatively small group of people, you need to become very proficient at convincing others that you are not to be messed with. One of the ways that archaic and then into classical period Greeks do this is by developing the technology and techniques of what's known as hoplite warfare. Hoplite warfare refers to kind of the equipment and fighting style of the people who are going to be active in fighting for the polis at this time. So, it's yet a different kind of fighting. This is not what you find in the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's no reference to this style of fighting, even though it's produced in the same time period as when people who fight actually do fight in the hoplite phalanx. And it's not something that you would have found in the Bronze Age. This is a new invention. It's a new way of military interaction, I guess you could say, if you were putting it mildly. What it involves is quite a large amount of very expensive armor and weaponry. Hoplite warriors would have to be equipped with a significant amount of body armor. This classically involved a helmet that, as you can see, is fairly solid, a breast and chest plate that covers your upper torso, a big round shield. A spear is the chief weapon that is going to be used, and the spear point would usually be iron, and the butt of the spear, the bottom of it, would be in bronze. Shields were wooden. Sometimes they had rings around them that were bronze. Sometimes the whole thing would be covered in a thin sheet of bronze, as this one pictured was. The armor, the chest plates would be bronze. The helmet would be bronze. So you needed bronze technology and resources in order to produce this equipment. And yet, it is enormously expensive, all of this stuff. The spears are reasonably inexpensive, but the rest of it is really it's a lot of money to put together this whole outfit. And then, once you've got your armor on and you're heavily covered up and protected, there would also be pieces that protected your shins and protected, like a shin guard for like soccer or something, and protected your other forearm as well in some cases. So, and gloves, etc. But at any rate, once you have this equipment on, the way that the hoplites fought was in something called a formation known as a phalanx. These were generally square, it wasn't that complicated, but you'd have people who would be arranged in ranks into a block. And so you have all of these heavily armored guys with long spears, and then they would stand in a square block next to each other. Sometimes they would be 12 by 12, sometimes it would be different numbers, but it didn't really matter. However many guys you had, you made that into a square. And if you had lots and lots of troops, you would make several squares, different phalanxes. But you formed them into a square block. And then, because they were heavily covered, they've got helmets on. It makes it very difficult to attack in the head. And then they've got the chest plates on, and they've got shin guards on, and then they've got these big round shields. The way the phalanx worked is that you stood in tight formation. And the way the shield worked is that you had a couple of points of holding on to it. So there would be kind of two handles on the back. One you slide your forearm into, and another you kind of wrap your fist around. So you hold the thing on sort of along, braced along your forearm in front of you. And because it's round, that means that you are covering about half of your body. This would be on your left arm, your left half of your body with your shield. And then the other half of the shield sticks out over to your right. And if you stand in tight formation, what that means is that your shield will cover half of you and half of the guy to your left. So that way, if you stand in a tight formation, what your enemy sees is a bunch of armor and a bunch of shields and nothing very much that you can attack very easily. And so that is how the hoplites fight. They fight in tight formation. They approach the enemy, and they practice moving in formation all in time together. And they start with a slow march, and then they break into a run, usually before they encounter their enemy. They crash into them. They stay in formation, however, and they're bristling with spears. And the ranks behind, whoever is first charging in the front, kind of keep their spears out of the way until they can be used. Often they'll have a short-bladed weapon as well, just for emergencies. But what they do is they've got this block bristling with spears and covered in armor. And so even if you're talking about a relatively small number of troops, 100, 200, they're really difficult. As long as they stay in formation and each of their shields is protecting the guy next to them, they're very difficult to hurt. They're difficult to attack. If you were to charge down and just randomly start swinging with your troops and they go to attack them, it's very difficult to get a blow in against this block of armored soldiers. As long as they stay in tight formation, they have tons of advantages. They're also more, I wouldn't say maneuverable, because it takes some doing to get the whole phalanx moved around, but they have some security because of the way they stand in this square. They can easily turn in formation as well, simply by just pivoting. So if the enemy were to circle around and try to come from behind, all they have to do is just turn around in place, and they're still in this defensive block. The same thing goes from the sides. They can turn and stay near each other and still present this kind of unbreakable wall. They're very difficult to hurt when they're in this situation, and they can whip out a lot of damage. So you have these very heavily armored, practiced, experienced fighters fighting in this phalanx. They can go up against armies that are significantly larger. As long as they have this advantage where they have much more armor on, they can do a lot more harm than can be done to them. As long as they stay in their tight formation, even a larger army has a very difficult time overrunning them and defeating them. And so the phalanx offers these major advantage, militarily speaking, over anybody that doesn't fight this way, that doesn't have this kind of equipment and doesn't fight with this technique. And that's going to be a big part of how they convince all of the original residents of all the places they end up, where they send their colony cities out, that it would be in their best interest to simply tolerate this new city and this new settlement of Greeks. Now, to make this work better, and make it more understandable, it's also important to realize that when the Greeks form colony cities, they don't do a lot of conquest inland. They're not grabbing up huge swaths of territory. Generally speaking, they carve out spots along the coastline. So it would be the land where they're going to put their new polis, the territory immediately around it for farmland. Then they kind of reach out feelers and try to establish friendly relations with the neighbors, trade partnerships, that kind of deal. They build city walls very quickly and they use their hoplite phalanx. And if you come to try to push them out of this area, they fight back and defend it. But they don't go on this kind of like massive rampage of conquest. So in most cases, people, even if they have regional kingdoms, regional kings, simply shrug a bit and they're like, well, I guess you can have that little spot there, and then we'll negotiate some kind of an arrangement. It usually worked out in that way, and that's part of how the Greeks are so successful in forming these colony cities all over the Mediterranean. They spread everywhere. Now I want to emphasize, every Greek city-state fights this way, with hoplites and in phalanxes. They all do. The most famous of these warriors is going to be the most famous city-state associated with this style of fighting is Sparta. But Athens fights this way, Corinth fights this way. All of the Greek city-states are going to fight in exactly this fashion. Now, there are advantages I've already kind of outlined a little bit to fighting in the hoplite phalanx. There are also disadvantages to hoplite phalanx fighting that you have to be aware of. It is expensive. And so for that reason, the hoplite phalanx is never going to be very large. Now that suits the Greeks down to the ground because they don't have a huge population to begin with. But you have to be aware of this as time goes on and some of the city-states grow more numerous and the colonies get more populous. The hoplite phalanx is always going to be limited to the number of people who can afford to equip themselves this way. This is not going to be a style of fighting that is easily accessible to the very poor, for instance. In order for a poor person to fight as a hoplite, somebody, maybe perhaps a whole family, has to pool their resources in order to produce a suit of armor and the weapons and the stuff that you need in order to participate this way. The other is that there are some tactical disadvantages that pop up, and some of these are just a curiosity I'll just mention. If you're not especially well trained, if the hoplite doesn't practice well, or if the people in it lose their nerve, you can end up with a situation where it fractures and falls apart, and then each of these individual fighters are more vulnerable than they would have been, although they're still quite heavily armored. If they lose the phalanx, they lose the advantage of those long spears, and then it becomes much more easy to defeat them. And so you have to watch out for that. And they did compensate for this when people organized, tacticians, generals, you could call them, organized their phalanx. They were careful to put people in positions where they could do the most good. So if you see the little picture there where everybody's in a block, not everybody in that square is in equal amounts of danger, and not all of them have equal amounts of responsibility. So when you're organizing the phalanx, you put your bravest soldiers in the front and the back. The front, because these are the people you're depending on to march in a straight line and attack, vigorously the enemy. The back, because those are the people who are going to break and run if anybody does. And so you want them to hold their ground, so that people in the middle, that's where you stick anybody you're a little unsure of. If you're like, well, this is their first battle, we're not sure how they're going to deal with this or cope with it, you stick them in the middle. Because once you're in the center of the phalanx, wherever the phalanx goes, that's where you go. So that's one of the things you have to consider. The other has to do with something, a phenomenon that's sometimes referred to as rightward drift. It's described in Thucydides. We'll talk about him in just a bit. But when you have your shield that is half over you and half over the guy next to you, there's a human nature tendency if you're charging at another group of people, whether they're in a phalanx themselves or not, they're dangerous and they've got pointy things, and they're going to try to stab you and kill you with them. When you see that group of people charging at you across the field, human nature will incline you to move your shield a little more over you and a little less over the guy next to you. That's just human nature. And since your shield is on your left arm, what that means is that your shield starts scooching a little bit further and further to the right. And so the person your shield is supposed to be covering notices they're feeling a little exposed, and so they start scooching a little bit more and more to the right to stay behind your moving shield. And this can have such an effect that the whole phalanx starts shifting to the right, and then they don't line up properly when they go to crash into the enemy across the field. So this is a thing that you have to compensate for. And generally speaking, it's issues like this, the tendency to get scared and break and run, to kind of come apart, to not hold your formation properly, to not move in good concert with each other. That's what makes one hoplite phalanx more vulnerable than the next. And so that's why Sparta, for instance, becomes enormously famous for having the best hoplite warriors ever, because they train and train and train and train and train and train, and they're really good at holding this formation. And so they can eventually start using longer spears than everybody else, and they're just professionals. We'll get to them, trust me, next week or so. But any hoplite phalanx is going to have a massive advantage fighting over anybody who doesn't use it. And so this is going to be a cornerstone to how the Greeks become politically dominant in the Mediterranean for a big swath of time. We'll talk about the exact way that plays out next time. And so as a result of sending out all of these colony ventures and the success of those ventures, the mother cities, the city-states of Greece, are going to kind of re-emerge as economically and politically important. They're going to become in some ways politically dominant, collectively, if not individually, in the Mediterranean, because they are able to call on the resources not just of their own immediate area, but to draw on everything they can gather up and connections they make with the rest of the Mediterranean. So, for instance, and you can see the examples of this, and you can see the remnants of this in some of the artifacts that you find in Greece that show the influence of artistic styles, the influence of inventions, the influence of various sort of cultural elements from the rest of the Mediterranean. So, for instance, you have just a few things to look at here. Coins. The actual use of a coin is something that was invented in the kingdom of Lydia, which is now modern Turkey, around 600 BC or so. Before that, precious metals were used as currency, but it was always done by weight. So that if you wanted to exchange silver for, grain, you had to weigh out the silver and then exchange it for the grain, and then you had to have a different process to figure out how pure the silver was that you were just exchanging. It was a whole complicated thing. The king of Lydia in 600 BC comes up with this great new innovation. He collects gold and silver, analyzes it, figures out how pure it is, and then what he does is he pours out, he doesn't do this himself, he orders it done, but he pours out kind of pre-measured amounts of gold and silver, and then to certify that this pre-measured amount is however much it is supposed to represent, he has it stamped or formed or molded into an image that reflects the royal house, the king himself. He puts the kind of official image on there. And so that way, instead of having to measure every time and do some calculations and get into a dickering argument over how pure this gold is versus some other kind of gold bar, now this gold has been pre-certified as weighing a certain amount and being a certain purity. So all you have to do is count them up. Tick, 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 tick. And so this facilitates trade, and it will be adopted by Greece in a massive way. You can see an example there with the owl. This is a coin that produced by Athens And in case you're wondering, it's a tetradrachm. It's a coin that's produced in such high quantities. They're all over the Mediterranean in archaeological sites. You can buy one of these. The last time I checked, you can buy a real one from, say, 400 BC or so. You can buy a real one of these for less than $4,000, the last I saw. So if you have any interest in coinage or antiquities, that's something you could invest in, perhaps. At any rate, other points of interest and influence. You can see artistically, the Sphinx of Naxos shows clear Assyrian influence. You have vases that show, again, Assyrian and Egyptian influence. That Kouros figure that you find, these kinds of things all over Greece in the Archaic period, clearly borrow from Egyptian statuary and Egyptian art. A lot of Greek art at that time does. And you can see the same kind of posture that you find in Egyptian statues, the same sort of hairstyle that you associate with Egyptian statues, a lot of the same artistic elements. Greece at this point, generally speaking, these Greek city-states are reaching out and forging connections and trade networks and kind of military contracts with places all over the Mediterranean. So it becomes a paradox, not unlike what we saw with the very first development of agriculture. Agriculture and city living didn't develop in places where it's very easy to grow food. It developed in places where growing food was profitable, but extremely hard work with irrigation and dragging water and ditches and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a weird, similar parallel with Greece. Greece is not going to become politically, culturally, linguistically dominant in the Eastern Mediterranean because Greece has so many resources. Ironically enough, they're going to become a very powerful force because they have very few resources, because there isn't enough farmland in Greece itself, which forces the Greek city-states to innovate militarily, technologically, and to push them kind of out into the Mediterranean in order to try to find prosperity that way. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks a lot.